Owen Parker was just a single father working the night shift, the kind of man CEO Catherine Blake had cut off in the middle of a conference room and coldly told, "That advice is outdated." All he had asked was for the company to maintain an offline backup, a printed emergency contact list, and a manual recovery process in case every automated system failed at once. The whole room had laughed. But at exactly 12 minutes past midnight, when every payment platform at Hayes & Co. was locked and dying, the only thing still breathing was his outdated advice. And before the sun came up, the man everyone had dismissed would become the last hope the company had left. The headquarters of Hayes & Co. occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower in downtown Charlotte, and on a Tuesday morning in late October, those floors pulsed with the kind of controlled energy that money produces. The conference room on the 32nd floor held a long obsidian table, a wall of LED screens cycling through financial dashboards, and 8 chairs filled by people who wore their authority invisibly but unmistakably. The company was 3 days away from signing a contract with a consortium of regional banks that would triple its processing volume and push its valuation past 9 figures for the first time. Every person in the room carried the quiet confidence of someone who expected to win. Owen Parker did not belong to that air. He appeared in the doorway at 9:47, carrying papers he had printed at the overnight desk. His white dress shirt was wrinkled from a full night shift. His navy trousers were old. His leather shoes showed wear at the toe. His 6-year-old daughter was asleep in the employee break room, and he had checked on her twice between rounds. Carter Brooks, head of building security, had asked him to come. Owen had been flagging anomalies in the company's secondary server cluster for the past 3 weeks. Small irregularities in the backup synchronization cycles, a magnetic door lock on the 3rd technical floor, responding half a second slower than normal, a cluster of workstation backup drives blinking out of sequence. None of it was dramatic. All of it, in Owen's experience, was worth mentioning before a company locked in a contract worth 9 figures. He stood at the edge of the room and waited for the right pause in the conversation. When it came, he introduced himself briefly, Owen Parker, overnight facilities and technical maintenance, and said he had a few observations about the company's operational continuity posture ahead of the contract signing. No one offered him a seat. He did not ask for one. He placed his papers on the corner of the table and walked through it plainly. The company had strong primary systems, excellent cloud redundancy, and a capable security vendor. But the recovery architecture assumed that if primary systems went down, the backup systems would come up. That assumption depended entirely on the authentication network remaining functional. If the authentication layer itself was compromised, if admin credentials were locked, vendor portals were inaccessible, or the cloud backup was encrypted alongside the live data, there was no documented offline recovery path. He recommended 4 things: an offline backup stored on physically disconnected drives, a printed emergency contact list for key banking partners, a tiered physical access protocol, independent of app-based credentialing, and a documented manual transaction recovery process that staff could execute without logging into anything. Julian Reeves, the chief technology officer, let out a short, practiced laugh. He said the company's systems had 3 layers of redundancy and a certified incident response team on retainer. He said what Owen was describing sounded like something from the mid-2000s. Margaret Sloan, the chief financial officer, glanced at her watch. Catherine Blake had been watching Owen from the far end of the table, with an expression that could have been curiosity or patience. She let him finish his second point. Then she cut across him with calm, unhurried authority. "Owen," she said, and the room went quiet the way rooms do when the person with the most power speaks into silence. "That advice is outdated. This company wasn't built on printed paper and old habits." A short beat passed. 2 people near the window exchanged a look that contained a small, private amusement. Owen did not argue. He did not flush or raise his voice. He picked up his papers, folded them once, and pressed them flat against his palm. The thing that stayed with him as he walked toward the door was not the laughter or the dismissal. It was the small face he had seen through the conference room glass as he spoke his daughter Grace, 6 years old, sitting in the hallway with a worn stuffed rabbit on her lap, watching through the window with her father's same steady eyes. He stepped into the corridor. Grace looked up from the rabbit. "Daddy," she said quietly, "did the lady say you were wrong?" Owen crouched down to her level. He smoothed the rabbit's ear once. "It's okay, Bug," he said. "Some things only need to be right at the right moment." Owen Parker had not always worked nights. For 4 years before Hayes & Co., he had run the operations desk at a small logistics center outside Columbus, Ohio, a regional hub that moved medical supplies and automotive parts across the Midwest, in a part of the state where winter storms could cut power lines for 12 hours without warning. In that environment, he had learned what no certification guaranteed: that technology is only as reliable as the conditions it was designed for, and conditions have a habit of changing without permission. He had learned to keep manual logs, to maintain phone lists that lived outside any software system, and to run test shutdowns every quarter, not to find failures, but to find the procedures that crumbled when people panicked. He had learned that the difference between a company that survived a blackout and one that lost a week was almost never the quality of its technology. His wife, Laura, had died 3 winters ago, black ice on Route 23 in December, Grace in the back seat, Owen following behind. Grace had kept a 2-week silence afterward. Owen had kept a permanent understanding of how quickly the reliable becomes the unreliable, and a daughter who needed him in a way that reorganized everything else. He had taken the night maintenance position at Hayes & Co. because the hours fit Grace's school schedule. Days he walked her to class and picked her up by 3. He slept in the late afternoon, while a neighbor watched the apartment. He was at Hayes by 9 in the evening, and back before Grace woke up. It was not an elegant arrangement, but it was a real one, built around what mattered most. His colleagues thought of Owen as somewhere between useful and eccentric. He fixed things reliably, and kept a spiral notebook in his chest pocket, where he wrote things others did not bother to write down. 3 weeks before the conference room incident, he had charted an irregularity in the secondary backup drives, not dramatic enough to trigger an automated alert, but consistent enough to tell him the backup synchronization was driven by the same authentication token system as the primary infrastructure. If that token was disrupted, both the live data and the backup would be vulnerable at the same moment. He had sent 2 emails about this. The first had gone to Julian Reeves's technical coordinator, who had forwarded it with a note that said, "Low priority maintenance staff observation." The second had gone directly to Julian, who had apparently read it, added no response, and let it age in his inbox like an unwanted reminder. Carter Brooks had taken it more seriously. He had made a habit of walking the overnight floors with Owen once a week, not because it was required, but because Owen had twice in the previous year spotted access anomalies that turned out to be legitimate security concerns. Carter trusted the man's eyes. None of these things existed at Hayes & Co. He carried Grace home that morning, along streets just beginning to fill with commuters. She held his hand and asked no more questions about the meeting. After a few blocks, she said, "Daddy, why did the rich people laugh when you were trying to help them?" Owen looked at the sidewalk for a moment. "Because sometimes people mix up what's new with what's right." Grace considered that. "That's dumb," she said. "Yeah," Owen said. "It kind of is." Catherine Blake had been running Hayes & Co. for 3 years. She had taken over from her father, Elliot Blake, who had built the company before a heart attack at 61 forced him to step back. Catherine had been 25 at the time, and her father had told her on the day he handed her the keys, "The hardest part of leadership was not making decisions. It was making them while everyone in the room was waiting for you to prove you were not a mistake." She was not naive about what people thought. She had heard the phrase "handed the seat" more times than she could count. She had responded by becoming the version of a CEO that left no room for that narrative moving fast, deciding cleanly, and keeping her public manner at exactly the temperature where competence begins to look cold. In 3 years, she had grown the company's processing volume by 240%. She had replaced legacy infrastructure with a modern cloud-based architecture, brought in Julian Reeves as CTO, and built a technical team that won industry recognition. She had done all of this under a board that expected results and investors who had begun to treat caution as a character flaw. The upcoming contract was the largest in the company's history. Catherine knew exactly what it would mean if she closed it. She also knew what it would mean if she did not. She had listened to Owen for exactly as long as it took her to categorize him. Night maintenance, printed handouts. She was not cruel, she was efficient. The line she used landed cleanly and ended a distraction. Julian had laughed first. She had not stopped him. After the meeting, she had taken Owen's pages and set them on the corner of her desk under the weight of a quarterly forecast. Not in the trash, just beneath, everything more pressing, which amounted to the same thing. That afternoon, passing through the corridor near the employee break room, she had seen Grace. The girl was sitting in one of the low chairs near the water fountain, the stuffed rabbit propped upright against the armrest beside her, small feet not quite reaching the floor. She was working through a page of second-grade arithmetic with a pencil, erasing more than she wrote. She looked absorbed and self-sufficient in the specific way children become when they have learned not to interrupt adults who are busy. Catherine slowed for half a step, then kept walking. That evening, the chairman of the board called. The conversation lasted 11 minutes and contained, in order, congratulations on the upcoming contract, confirmation that the board expected it to close as scheduled, a reminder that the current momentum was producing investment interest from 2 additional institutional partners, and a final sentence that sat inside Catherine's chest long after she had hung up. "Catherine," he had said, "we're all watching you succeed." She stood at her office window in the dark and looked at the city below. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass and said quietly, "To no one, not weak, not slow, not wrong." The night before the contract signing, Hayes & Co. ran on all cylinders. The legal team was still in conference rooms at 4 in the afternoon. The technical staff cycled through pre-launch checklists. The executive floor hummed with the silence of people working too hard to talk. Owen clocked in at 9 and started his standard rounds. Elevator shafts, electrical closets, the HVAC relays on the mechanical floor, the server annex on sublevel 4. He moved through the building with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done the same walk hundreds of times and could read its moods the way a sailor reads water. At 10:43, he found the first thing. The network printer in the internal operations suite on the 27th floor had produced a page of unreadable character strings, not a print job anyone had sent, just a sequence of symbols that looked like a partial protocol dump. Owen photographed it with his phone, folded the page into his notebook, and kept moving. At 11:16, the magnetic access lock on the secondary technical corridor, the same one he had been clocking as slightly slow for 3 weeks, registered a 3-second delay on his badge read. He noted the timestamp. At 11:41, he crouched in the server annex and watched the backup drives cycle. 3 of the 7 drives in the secondary tier were blinking on a 4-second offset from the main array. Not the firmware update that Julian had proposed as an explanation. The offset was irregular. It pulsed, steadied, pulsed again. He found Carter Brooks in the security monitoring room and showed him the notebook entries. Carter studied the printer page for a long moment without speaking. He picked up his radio and did not put it down right away. Owen said, "Don't restart the synchronization process. If something's sitting in the auth token layer, a restart pushes it through the backup cycle." Carter forwarded the notes to Julian's on-call technical coordinator. Julian himself was in a preparation session with the presentation team. His coordinator summarized the report in a single line. Night maintenance flagging some hardware inconsistencies, probably a firmware issue, and added it to the bottom of Julian's notification queue. Julian did not see it before midnight. Owen sat at his maintenance workstation and opened his notebook. He sketched the synchronization architecture from memory. Primary data layer, authentication node, cloud backup tier, secondary local backup. The conclusion took less than a minute to reach. The cloud backup was not a separate system, it was a mirror. If the authentication node was compromised, the mirror would reflect the corruption along with everything else. He wrote a short email to Julian and to Carter, flagging the specific scenario. The subject line read, "Priority note, do not restart main cluster if auth failure detected overnight." The body was 6 sentences. He sent it at 11:53. He also, before starting his final rounds, walked to the equipment storage room on sub-level 2 and located a set of offline backup drives sealed in a static-proof case dated 14 months ago, part of the prior IT infrastructure that Julian had technically replaced but never formally decommissioned. The security seal was intact. Owen did not break it. He wrote the drive set's serial number in his notebook and took a photograph. Then he went to get Grace from the employee lounge, where she had fallen asleep under his jacket with the rabbit tucked under her arm. Somewhere inside the tower, on a monitoring screen no one was watching, a small red status indicator blinked once and vanished. The call came at 12:17. Not a call exactly, an automated alert, then a cascade of alerts, then the kind of silence on a dashboard that is louder than any alarm because it means the system doing the alarming has itself stopped working. Julian Reeves was 4 blocks from home when 3 rapid alerts hit his phone at once. The transaction dashboard had gone red. Partner bank confirmations had stopped. By 12:41, the 4th floor operations center held 5 people who had not expected to be there. Catherine had arrived with her blazer thrown over a dress shirt, her face composed in a way that required effort. Julian was at a workstation. Pale in the monitor glow, working through admin login attempts the system rejected without explanation. Margaret Sloan was there because 3 banking partners had already called her personal cell. The cloud backup environment had displayed a confirmation receipt when the authentication attack began, which meant it had treated the corrupted token as a valid synchronization instruction. By the time Julian confirmed the backup tier had been affected, approximately 40 minutes had passed since the first anomaly. Every modern redundancy the company had purchased was accessible through the same authentication architecture that had just been locked. The dashboard, the cloud, the vendor portal, the incident response hotline, all of it lived behind the same door, and the door was closed. Julian said with some difficulty that he needed to restart the primary cluster. Carter Brooks entered the room at 12:52. He had been on another floor when the alerts began. He stood in the doorway for a moment, reading the room. Owen sent an email at 11:53, he said. Subject line was, "Do not restart the main cluster if auth failure detected overnight." The room went quiet in a particular way. Catherine pulled up her forwarded documents from that morning and found Owen's folded pages under the quarterly forecast. She read them standing, moving fast. Do not restart the primary cluster. Julian had been 40 seconds from doing exactly that. Isolate the secondary server node. Use the printed contact list. Verify the offline backup drives. Each line matched something in the room with a precision that felt almost punishing. He called this, Margaret said quietly, and did not seem to intend it as a compliment. Catherine did not respond to that. She looked at Carter. Do we have a number for him? Carter went to the personnel secondary roster, the supplemental file maintained for contract and overnight staff, separate from the main HR portal, which was inaccessible. He found Owen's cell number in a paper printout kept in a binder behind the security desk. He brought it to Catherine. She dialed at 1:03 in the morning. Owen picked up on the 3rd ring. His voice was level and unhurried, the voice of someone who had been awake for his own reasons and had not been startled by the phone. "Owen," Catherine said, and she did not try to hide everything that was in her voice. "We need you back here." There was a short pause. "Has anyone restarted the main cluster?" Julian, standing close enough to hear the call, said tightly. "Not yet. We were about to." "Don't," Owen said. "If you restart with the auth node still compromised, you lock everything simultaneously. The secondary server will read the restart as a new sync request, and you'll lose the last clean instance you have." Catherine heard the quiet of the apartment behind his voice, the particular stillness of late night in a place where a child sleeps. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. He drove through a sleeping city with Grace wrapped in his jacket in the back seat, the rabbit pressed between her cheek and the seatbelt. He looked at her in the rearview mirror. "Dad has to fix something before morning, Bug. You'll sleep through it." Grace closed her eyes. Owen did not think about the conference room. He thought about the drives on sub-level 2 and the email he had sent at 11:53 and what he was going to do when he got there. He arrived at 1:06. The lobby guard had him badged through before he finished pulling his jacket on. He carried Grace against his shoulder, her head low against his neck, the rabbit dangling from her fingers. The fourth-floor operations center held more people. Now 2 junior engineers had been called in. A legal advisor sat against the wall with a laptop, and Margaret Sloane stood near the window with her arms folded in the way of some. Margaret looked at Grace. "The operations center isn't appropriate for Carter," Owen said. Carter was already at his side. Owen shifted Grace gently into Carter's arms, took a moment to settle the rabbit against her properly, and spoke quietly into her half-sleeping ear. "Bug, you're going to stay with Mr. Carter for a little while. He'll set you up in the restroom." Grace's fingers found Owen's collar and held it for a moment. "Are you going to get yelled at again?" she asked. "Probably," Owen said. "Okay," she said, and let go. Carter took her down the hall without a word. Catherine, who had been watching from the doorway, did not look away from the exchange. She had heard Grace's question and its answer, and something in the plainness of that conversation, the matter-of-fact resignation of a child who expected her father to be treated poorly, settled into her with a weight she did not entirely know what to do with. Owen stood in the center of the operations room and looked at the screens. He took the room in the way he took a building in, methodically, from the perimeter to the center, identifying what was still working before cataloging what was not. Then he pulled his notebook from his chest pocket and set it on the nearest desk. He needed 5 things, he said, stated flatly, without preamble. Physical disconnection of the secondary server node from the main network backbone. Manual retrieval of the offline backup drive set from sub-level 2, serial number in his notebook. A print run from the local accounting cache if any workstation still had direct database access. Direct outreach to banking partners using numbers outside the CRM system. And a freeze on all admin login attempts from any machine that had been active in the past 4 hours. Julian Reeves folded his arms. "You're telling me we're running a recovery operation off a drive set from 14 months ago based on what a maintenance tech put in a notebook?" Owen looked at him without any particular expression. "Where do you keep your current backup?" Julian did not answer immediately. The answer, which they both knew, was inside an authentication environment that was now inaccessible. "The systems I'm describing," Owen said, "don't need permission from the thing that attacked you. That's the only reason they still exist." He paused and looked at Julian directly. "You asked where I learned this. I ran logistics for a hospital supply network during back-to-back blizzards in Ohio. If our system went down, surgeries got rescheduled and people ran out of what they needed. I learned very quickly what happens when the only recovery path you built runs through the thing that just broke." The room held that statement for a moment. Catherine said, quietly and clearly, "Give him access to what he needs." Julian started to object. She cut across him in the same tone she had used to cut across Owen that morning, except this time, the weight of the room was behind it. "He was right this morning," she said, "which means we're going to give him what he needs tonight." Owen turned back to the equipment roster without acknowledgement. He walked to the desk nearest the secondary server monitor and picked up a radio. "Carter," he said into it, "I need the physical key for the sub-level equipment cage." A pause then. "On my way." On the desk to his left, opened and slightly worn from folding, were the pages he had brought to that conference room 16 hours earlier. He did not look at them. He already knew what they said. The drive set from sub-level 2 was sealed in a graphite-colored static case, the top secured with a numbered tamper strip and a date stamp reading 14 months ago. Owen broke the seal with a key from Carter's ring, lifted the top, and checked each drive against the serial numbers he had photographed the night before. All 5 were present. The last synchronization log printed on the inside lid of the case showed a clean run to a point 36 hours before the current attack window. It was not a perfect state. No one had expected it to be. Owen set the case on the center workstation and began walking through his approach with the same directness he had used in the conference room, except now the people in the room were listening with the particular attention of people who understood that the alternative was losing everything. The company did not need to be fully restored before morning. That was the first thing they had to accept. Full restoration was a 2-day project at minimum and would require a forensic audit of every system the authentication failure had touched. What they needed to accomplish before the 6 o'clock window was narrower and more achievable. Prove that the payment core was functional, protect the data integrity of the most recent clean state, and demonstrate to their banking partners that the company was managing the situation rather than being managed by it. He divided the work into 4 parallel tracks. Julian and his engineers would compare the offline drive state against the accounting system's local cache to reconstruct the transaction record for the 36-hour gap separating confirmed transactions from unconfirmed ones, documented clearly enough to satisfy an auditor. Carter would physically segment the network floor by floor. Margaret would work through the printed contact sheet to brief the banking partners directly. Catherine would manage partner communications at the executive level. Owen said it plainly. The partners already knew something was wrong. They needed a timeline and a plan, not spin. Julian had pushed back on the transaction reconstruction approach. He said it would introduce reconciliation risk. Owen nodded and said yes, it would, and that reconciliation risk was substantially more manageable than the alternative, which was presenting zero evidence of data integrity to a banking consortium in 4 hours. Julian went quiet after that. The recovery process ran for the first 90 minutes at a pace that felt agonizingly methodical to everyone in the room except Owen, who understood that careful and slow were not the same thing. At 2:43, the offline drives were connected to the isolated recovery workstation. At 3:12, the local payment core initialized on the recovery environment. At 3:28, the progress bar on the database reconciliation process stood at 71% and stopped. The room tightened. Margaret looked at the screen with the expression of someone watching a car accident develop slowly enough to know the outcome before it happens. Julian said it immediately. The restore is hung. Owen looked at the system log without touching anything. He read through 20 lines of output in approximately 15 seconds. The recovery process had paused because a background authentication daemon on the recovery workstation, a small service installed as part of a routine update months earlier, was still attempting to contact the primary authentication server to verify its license status. The authentication server was unreachable. The daemon was waiting for a response that would never come, and it was blocking the file write process until it got one. In a connected, fully operational environment, this would never have been noticed. In a recovery scenario where every second was accountable, it was a 2-hour delay wearing the costume of a system failure. Owen said, I need someone to pull the network cable from the secondary input port on that machine. One of the junior engineers, a young woman who had been watching Owen work with growing attention, looked at the cable and then at Julian. Julian said nothing. Owen looked at the engineer directly. The service is trying to verify a license from a server that isn't responding. If we take it offline completely, it falls back to a grace period and releases the write block. We can log the deviation for the audit and continue. The engineer pulled the cable. The progress bar resumed at 71%. It moved to 74, 79, 86. The room had gone entirely silent. 91, 97. At 3:44 in the morning, a single status line appeared on the recovery terminal screen. Green text on a black background. Core payment recovery. Active. Someone exhaled sharply. Someone else put both hands flat on the desk and pressed down as though confirming the surface was still there. Catherine stood very still in the center of the room. She did not look at Julian or at Margaret. She looked at the screen. Owen made a note in his notebook. He did not smile. He moved to the next item on the list. By 4 in the morning, The shape of what had happened was clear enough to state plainly. 6 weeks earlier, a third-party vendor onboarded rapidly. To support the expansion push had been granted administrative access far broader than their stated scope. Julian had approved it during a period of overlapping deadlines without a full security review. The vendor was later compromised by a separate attack, and the credentials they held for Hayes & Co. were used to seed a dormant instruction set into the authentication synchronization cycle. It had waited for a high-activity window, triggered, and locked the system from the inside out using keys it had been handed. Owen walked through this reconstruction calmly, using system logs still accessible from the recovery environment and the change history he pulled from the local backup. He did not editorialize. He stated facts in sequence. He did note, once, without looking at Julian when he said it, that the attack had been designed to affect both the primary and cloud backup simultaneously, because both were synchronized through the same authentication node. If the company had maintained a disconnected offline backup on a separate cycle, as he had recommended, the attack surface would have been substantially smaller, and the recovery timeline would have been measured in hours rather than in a race against sunrise. Julian began to explain the vendor approval process. Margaret started to raise the contractual timeline pressure that had driven the rapid onboarding. Catherine said, "Stop." Both of them stopped. She stood at the window, the same window from which she had watched the city the night before, and told herself she would not be weak or slow or wrong. The city below was beginning its pre-dawn routines. A sanitation truck moved along the street. A delivery van idled at a traffic light, the world in its most ordinary form, indifferent to the catastrophe that had just been averted at height. Carter told her quietly that Owen had submitted written warnings on 3 separate occasions. Not framed as crises, not sent with urgency flags or copied to the board to make a point, just filed through the appropriate channels, described accurately, and left for the people above him to act on. None of them had been acted on. Catherine walked down the hall. She stood in the doorway of the restroom where Grace was sleeping in a chair, the rabbit held against her chest, her head listing to one side in the way of children who can sleep through anything. On the tray table beside her, there was a drawing done in pencil, a large rectangular building with rows of windows, and in front of it a much smaller figure with arms extended, holding the structure up from below. Catherine stood there for a long moment. She came back to the operations center. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the people in it, at Julian, whose expression had shifted from defensive to hollowed out, at Margaret, whose financial calculus was visibly being revised in real time, at the young engineers who had worked through the night without complaint. She said, "For the rest of the recovery, Owen leads. If anyone has a question about the process, they ask him. If anyone has an objection, they bring it to me after." Julian said, "You're letting a maintenance technician run a Tier 1 system recovery." Catherine said, "No. I'm letting the only person who was right from the beginning lead us out of the mistakes the rest of us made." The room did not produce a response to that. Owen checked the time. 3 hours and 40 minutes before the first banking partner meeting was scheduled. "If we want to save the contract," he said, "we need to prove the system can process real transactions before 5. Let's move." Owen divided the remaining work the way he might divide a building, before an inspection, not by urgency, which creates chaos, but by dependency. Some things had to happen before other things could happen, and understanding that sequence was the difference between a recovery and a panic wearing the costume of productivity. Julian and his team cleaned the transaction data from the 36-hour gap. They sorted approximately 18,000 transactions into 3 categories: confirmed by bankside receipt, pending, and indeterminate. Owen had given them a specific standard. Do not attempt to resolve the indeterminate category before morning. Document its scope, flag it for audit, report it to the partners accurately. A known unknown was manageable. A falsified reconciliation was a federal liability. Julian had pushed back on that. The number of unresolved transactions, he said, would alarm the partners. Owen had said, "What alarms partners is finding out their counterparty lied to them. What builds trust is finding out their counterparty knew the scope of the problem and told them honestly. Julian had looked at him for a long moment and then returned to his workstation. Carter's team swept the building floor by floor, pulling machines that had been active during the compromise window and quarantining anything suspect. He worked without comment and without drama. Margaret worked through Owen's contact sheet with unexpected speed, direct and precise on each call, wasting nothing. She had always known how to manage a crisis. She had just never been handed the right tool. Catherine had taken the hardest conversations, the partners whose exposure was largest, the ones who had the most standing to walk away. She did not read from a script. She described what had happened, described the recovery steps in sequence, described the outstanding uncertainties with precision, and told each partner directly that she would rather lose a contract through honesty than keep one through evasion. 2 partners asked for written documentation before the morning meeting. She told them they would have it. At 4:40, Owen ran the first test transaction through the recovery system, a small synthetic transfer between 2 internal test accounts, the kind of thing used to verify that a system can process a real exchange before a real one is attempted. The room around him had gone silent, without being asked to. The transaction sat in processing for 7 seconds. Then the confirmation returned. Then the second. Then the third. At transaction 4, an automatic discrepancy flag appeared in the reconciliation report. Julian saw it first and said, sharply, that the system was showing a net imbalance in the test account. Owen looked at the flag without moving. He opened the reconciliation log and scrolled back 14 lines. The imbalance was not a data error. The recovery environment had been isolated and then reconnected at a point in the business day when the time zone offset for batch processing had not been reapplied. The system was time-stamping transactions against a baseline that was off by 8 hours relative to the bankside records. Every transaction would show a discrepancy that corresponded to no actual financial difference. It was, from a certain angle, a sophisticated-looking problem. It was also a problem Owen had encountered years before, in a logistics system in Ohio that had been restored after a power event during daylight saving time. He had diagnosed it then in 40 minutes. Tonight, with the hours compressed and the stakes substantial, he diagnosed it in 90 seconds. He changed a single offset value in the batch processing configuration table, reran the test transaction, and watched the reconciliation balance clear. Julian had been prepared to call the restore a failure. He was quiet now. Catherine was watching Owen with an expression that was not sentiment and was not calculation. It was the look of someone revising a prior assessment and being honest with themselves about the cost of having held the previous one. At 4:58, the recovery environment processed its 12th sequential transaction without error. At 5:04, Margaret received a call from the largest banking partner. They had reviewed the night's incident documentation. They were willing to proceed with the morning meeting. They had questions, and they wanted answers on the record. The morning sky beyond the glass had shifted from black to a deep and specific shade of blue, the color that exists for perhaps 20 minutes before sunrise, the color that belongs only to the end of very long nights. Owen looked at the dashboard. The status line read, "Emergency payment route stable." He wrote one more note in his notebook, closed it, and pressed it flat against his chest. He had not slept in 22 hours. He was not tired in a way that mattered yet. The conference room on the 32nd floor was the same room it had been the morning before. The same table, the same screens, the same view of Charlotte below. What was different was the silence in it. Catherine entered at 6:50 looking like someone who had been awake all night and had made no attempt to disguise it. Hair pulled back, jacket slightly wrinkled, eyes clear in the way that long nights can clarify. Julian sat near the door. Margaret was at the far end of the table, with a printed incident summary. The 2 junior engineers stood near the window, too tired to sit. Owen stood at the back of the room near the secondary entrance. He had not been asked to attend. He had come because Catherine had asked him, quietly, in the hallway before anyone else arrived. "Please stay," she had said. "You should be there when they ask." He had nodded, and said nothing else. The banking representatives entered at 7:03, a senior vice president of technology risk, a contracts director, and a legal advisor. And they sat down with the careful neutrality of people who have been briefed on an incident and are present to form their own opinion. Catherine presented the night's events in sequence. She did not soften the attack's severity or exaggerate the completeness of the recovery. She described what had gone wrong, who had approved the vendor access that created the vulnerability, what the company had done between midnight and 5 in the morning to stabilize the payment core, and what remained outstanding. She described the indeterminate transaction set with its exact scope. She outlined the audit process and its timeline. When she was finished, the technology risk officer asked who had designed the recovery process. Catherine did not hesitate for long. A second, perhaps too long enough to know what the easier answer would have been. Then she turned toward the back of the room and said, "The man I publicly dismissed in this room yesterday morning." The banking representatives turned. Owen stood still and did not perform anything. Catherine continued. She said that Owen Parker, a night shift maintenance technician, had flagged the exact failure mode 3 weeks before the attack occurred. She said he had recommended offline backup procedures, printed contact protocols, and manual recovery processes that this company had declined to implement because they were considered outdated. She said that when the attack occurred, his notebook contained the only accurate description of what had gone wrong and what would fix it. And she said that she had failed, as the person responsible for this company's decisions, to extend reasonable professional respect to a warning because of where it came from rather than what it said. She said, "Owen, last night this company was not saved by the most current technology. It was saved by someone with enough experience to prepare for the day all the current technology failed. I was wrong to dismiss you. I'm sorry. It was not a speech. It did not have a shape designed to impress the audience. It was a straightforward accounting of a specific error and its consequences, delivered by someone who understood that honesty at cost is worth more than diplomacy at comfort." Near the side door, Grace had slipped in from the hallway where Carter had been watching her. She stood very quietly, holding the rabbit at her side, and watched her father stand at the back of a room, while a woman at the front of it told the truth about him. The senior vice president of technology risk said, "We appreciate the transparency, and then, we'd like to continue discussions, conditional on a completed audit and a documented resilience protocol within 60 days. It was not the clean triumph of a signed contract. It was something more durable, the kind of trust that is built after a failure, which is the only kind of trust that has been tested." Owen looked at Catherine across the length of the room. "Whatever this company builds next," he said, "every warning from every level deserves a hearing. That's the only condition I have." In the days that followed, Hayes & Co. did not pretend the crisis had been a controlled demonstration. The vendor whose compromised credentials had served as the attack vector was suspended from all access and placed under legal review. The contracts team identified 3 other vendor relationships with similarly overbroad permission grants and suspended each of them pending review. Julian Reeves was formally reprimanded and placed on a performance improvement plan that required him to work directly with Owen through the entire resilience audit, an arrangement that neither of them found comfortable and both of them executed with professional correctness. Margaret Sloan revised the company's risk management policy to include operational resilience as a line item in the capital planning budget. Offline backup procedures, printed contact protocols, and manual recovery documentation were no longer categorized as legacy overhead. They were categorized as infrastructure. Owen was offered a new role. Catherine created it specifically after a conversation with the board. The title was Director of Operational Resilience. It came with a team, a budget, and authority over the disaster recovery architecture of every system the company operated. Owen had looked at the offer letter for a long time before responding. His one stated condition was flexibility around his daughter's schedule. Catherine had said yes before he finished the sentence. She had also, separately, gone to find Grace in the company cafe. She sat down and waited until Grace had finished her sandwich before she said anything. She said, "I wanted to apologize. I was unkind to your dad, and you saw it." Grace considered this. "I know," she said. "Dad says the important thing is whether people fix their mistakes." "Your dad is right," Catherine said. "He's right about a lot of stuff," Grace said, and returned to her lunch. Catherine smiled briefly and honestly, in a way she did not often let people see. Julian came to Owen 2 weeks later, in the server room where Owen was overseeing installation of the new offline backup infrastructure. He said, without quite meeting Owen's eyes, that he appreciated how Owen had handled the recovery. Owen set down the drive unit he was holding. He said, "The next time someone below you on an org chart hands you a warning, don't ask them what their title is before you decide whether to read it. Ask them what they're seeing." Julian nodded once and left. The company's operations floor, when Owen walked through it a month later, looked much as it always had: modern screens, real-time dashboards, the visual language of a technology company doing well. But fixed to the wall beside the lead operations terminal was a new addition: a laminated card, updated weekly, listing direct contact numbers for every critical partner. Above the server room entrance, a cabinet held the new offline backup drives behind a glass panel and a tamper-evident seal dated to the current week. In the emergency protocol folder on every floor, Captain's desk was a 12-page manual that began with a single line: "If digital access is unavailable, begin here." The old and the new occupied the same space without contradiction. That had been Owen's design, and Catherine had approved it without modification. 3 weeks after the crisis, Hayes & Co. held an all-hands meeting. Catherine stood at the front of the room with no prepared slides behind her, just the company's name on a plain screen, and a room full of people who had been part of what happened. She talked about the night of the attack. She talked about what the company had gotten wrong, not in a corporate way that distributes blame uniformly until it disappears, but in a specific way that named the decisions and the people who made them, including herself. She said the company had confused speed with intelligence and novelty with competence, and both of those confusions had nearly cost them everything. Then she said something the room had not expected. She said, "Resilience is not old-fashioned. It is preparedness. The only difference is whether you make the plan before you need it or after you've already lost something." Owen was in a chair near the side of the room. Grace sat beside him in a seat too large for her, feet dangling, the rabbit on her lap, wearing a green sweater and paying close attention in the way children do when they sense something important without knowing exactly why. Catherine looked at Owen and asked him to stand. He was not a man who enjoyed this. He stood because Grace was watching. The room applauded, not the loud, reflexive applause of a corporate ceremony, but the quieter, more specific kind that carries actual meaning, the kind that comes when people have thought about what they are acknowledging and decided it deserves to be acknowledged. Owen spoke for 4 minutes. He said that good technology was not the enemy of good judgment, the two needed each other. He said the questions worth asking were not complicated. What happens when the power goes out? When the network drops? When the account is locked? When the only person who knows the recovery process is not in the emergency contact list? He said those questions were not pessimistic. They were the baseline of responsible operation. He sat back down. Grace leaned against his arm. Later, as they walked out into a clear November morning, Catherine was standing at the lobby doors. She watched them pass without speaking. Grace looked up at her and said, matter-of-factly, "Is Daddy still outdated?" Catherine met the girl's eyes. "No," she said. "He was never outdated. I was just looking at the wrong things." Owen held the door for Grace and they walked out together into the light. Behind them, in a company that had just paid an expensive price for a lesson it should have learned for free, the work went on. And in a cabinet on sub-level 2, a new set of drives sat sealed and dated and ready, just in case.